The rain was coming down sideways the night I crouched next to a stranger's dead sedan on a back road outside town, my fingers numb as I traced wiring under a hood worth more than my entire house. He had on an expensive coat and never gave me a name worth remembering. I only told him I was a single father who fixed cars for a living. I wouldn't take his money, shut the hood, and drove my old truck home. The next morning, the sound of heavy engines woke me before my alarm went off. 6 black SUVs had sealed off my driveway. Then the middle door swung open. For almost 2 years I'd been the best diagnostic tech in the county that nobody would hire. I worked out of a battered pickup with nearly 250,000 miles on it, a toolbox bolted into the bed, and ran a single-bay garage behind a rented house on the edge of a town most people only glimpsed through a windshield on their way to somewhere better. I charged $40 an hour when the shops downtown charged 4 times that, and I still lost jobs to men who couldn't read a wiring diagram if their lives depended on it. My daughter Lily was 11, and she'd learned to tell the difference between the months I got paid and the months I got promises. She never complained about either, which somehow made it worse. I understood exactly how I'd ended up there, and that understanding was the heaviest tool I carried. Before all this, I'd been a senior diagnostic specialist at Sterling Motors Regional Service Network, the guy they flew out to other states when a car did something the manual swore was impossible. I was making close to 6 figures. I had insurance. I had a badge that opened doors in buildings with marble floors. Then I found a pattern in one of their flagship sedans, a flaw in the electronic control system that only surfaced under a specific mix of heat, humidity, and low voltage. It wasn't constant, which is why nobody had caught it. It wasn't random either, which is why it scared me. The pattern showed up in 11 vehicles across 4 states in a single quarter. Drivers reported a brief loss of throttle response, a dashboard that blinked and reset, and in 3 cases the assisted braking cutting out for 2 to 5 seconds. At highway speed, 2 seconds is 200 feet of road that belongs to nobody. I wrote it up exactly the way I'd been trained. Logged fault codes, environmental conditions, replicated results, and a verification procedure any dealership could run with equipment they already had. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon, certain the system would take it from there. That was the last afternoon of my old life, and I didn't know it yet. Vanessa Sterling ran the region. She came from money the way weather comes rolling in from the west, constant, and never apologizing for it. 42 years old, sharp as a blade, her family had sat on the Sterling board for 3 generations. She called me into a glass-walled conference room and asked me, very pleasantly, to sign an amended version of my own report, one that blamed all 11 incidents on poor owner maintenance. When I said no, the pleasantness drained out of that room like heat through an open door. In front of 6 managers, she told me a mechanic ought to know his place instead of imagining he could lecture a billion-dollar company's board. Nobody at that table looked up from their notepads. I remember thinking the silence cost them nothing and cost me everything. 6 weeks later I was let go for failure to follow established process, a phrase vague enough to mean whatever they needed it to mean. What followed was quieter, and far more effective. I applied to 11 dealerships and 2 independent chains across 3 counties. Every one of them liked me in the interview, called my references, and then stopped picking up the phone. One service manager, a decent guy named Frank Doyle, finally told me the truth in a parking lot because he couldn't stomach saying it indoors. My name had been flagged somewhere it shouldn't have been, and anyone who hired me would suddenly find their parts orders and warranty reimbursements mysteriously delayed. I didn't sue. A lawsuit against the Sterling family isn't really a legal fight, it's a spending contest, and I had $800 to my name. I kept a copy of my original notes at the bottom of my toolbox, under the sockets, the way some men keep a photograph. So that was my life on the evening in question, driving home through a storm that had been building all afternoon, $90 in my pocket from replacing a water pump on a schoolteacher's minivan. My wipers were worn down to bare metal, and I couldn't afford new ones until Friday. Lily was staying at my sister Carol's for the night, so nobody was waiting up, which meant I had no reason to hurry and no reason to stop. I saw the hazards first. A slow orange pulse against the guardrail about a mile past the old reservoir bridge. Then I saw the car itself, long and pale in the rain, and a man in a dark coat standing beside it with no umbrella, no hood up, just standing there soaked with the stillness of someone who's run out of ideas. He looked to be in his early 70s, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym. His coat was cashmere and ruined. His shoes made no sense on a wet shoulder in the middle of nowhere. I told him I was a mechanic and asked what the car had done before it died. He said his name was Walter, that the dashboard had lit up like a carnival before everything went dark, and that his phone hadn't had signal since the bridge. He didn't tell me anything else about himself, and at the time I chalked that up to ordinary caution from a wealthy man alone on a dark road, which it partly was. The car was a Sterling Regal, the current generation, with the newer integrated control system and a sticker price north of $140,000. I knew that platform inside and out. I'd spent the last year and a half of my career living inside it. Something in my chest tightened in a way I didn't like, and I told myself it meant nothing. Plenty of these cars on the road, and this was simply the kind of county where rich men drive. I pulled my skin tool and my old toolbox out of the truck bed, the box scratched and dented, my father's initials scratched into the lid with a nail. Walter looked at it a long moment, then asked, with genuine curiosity and no trace of cruelty, whether I actually believed I could fix a car like this on the side of the road. I'd been asked that in worse tones by smaller men, so it didn't land the way it might have. I told him I wouldn't know until I looked. He stepped back and held my flashlight when I asked him to, and he held it steady, which is rarer than people think. I got the hood up, ran my scanner, and watched the codes populate the cracked little screen one after another. Communication loss on the powertrain bus. An intermittent low-voltage reference fault. A supervisory module locked into a protective state, refusing to reset. I read that sequence 3 times in the rain, and the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the exact signature I documented 2 years earlier and been called a liar for. I found what I expected. A connector at the harness junction behind the front wheel had corroded at the pin seat. Under moisture, the reference voltage dropped just far enough that the module read it as a fault and shut everything down. I cleaned the pins, applied dielectric grease from a tube that had been in my box since before the pandemic, reseated the connector, and cycled the system. The car woke up like nothing had happened, all that expensive light spilling onto wet asphalt. Then I did something that wasn't strictly my business. I ran a temporary jumper to give that reference circuit a redundant ground path, so if the connector went marginal again on his way home, the module wouldn't drop out and leave him stranded in the dark. I closed the hood and told him plainly not to drive that car any farther than he had to, and to get the whole harness and module inspected by someone who'd actually pull the logs instead of clearing them. He asked how a mobile mechanic knew a proprietary system that well. I told him I used to work for the company that made it, and left it there, because self-pity on a roadside is a bad look on anyone. He reached into his coat and held out a fold of bills. Several $100s at least, with the casual certainty of a man who's never had money refused. I told him no. It had taken 20 minutes. He didn't put it away. He looked at my mismatched tailgate, my soaked jacket, and I could see him running the math and getting an answer that didn't balance. He asked why. I told him he was stuck in the rain, I could help, and that was the whole of it. Then I handed him the spare rain slicker from behind my seat, because he was 72 and shaking, and told him to leave it on whatever porch he liked when he was done. He put it on. He looked ridiculous, $4 of yellow plastic over cashmere, and didn't seem to care at all. I was halfway to my truck when he called after me and asked for my full name. I told him, Ethan Cole. For 1 second, no longer than the space between 2 wiper strokes, something crossed that old man's face I couldn't read then and haven't forgotten since. Not quite surprise. More like a man finding the missing corner piece of a puzzle he'd been told didn't have one. He thanked me, got in his car, and I watched his taillights disappear east into the rain. I went home, ate cereal over the sink the way you do when your kid isn't there to see it, and slept badly. In the morning I picked Lily up from Carol's, drove her to school, took a call about a starter motor across the county. I thought about Walter maybe twice all week, and both times it was about the fault codes, not the man. Walter Kessler, on the other hand, thought about little else. This part one only learned afterward, in pieces, from people who were in the room. He drove that sedan straight to the Sterling Technical Center in Millbrook at 8 the next morning and handed the keys to the Director of Engineering Validation, telling them to find out exactly what had gone wrong and to be careful, because he already knew. The search pulled up hundreds of documents. Buried in the second branch was a technical incident report filed 25 months earlier, covering 11 vehicles across 4 states, with logged conditions, replicated results, a proposed fix. The name on the signature line was Ethan Cole. Walter read it twice, then asked the obvious question why the man who'd first flagged this problem no longer worked for the company. HR's answer came back clean and short. Separated for unprofessional conduct and failure to follow established process. Walter had built this company from a 2-bay shop decades earlier, and 50 years in the business had taught him that clean, short answers are usually a door with something ugly behind them. He handed the file to Grace Holloway, lead counsel to the board, a woman known for being right about documents and never accused of enthusiasm. She found it in under 6 hours. The report sitting in the corporate archive wasn't the one I'd signed. 3 paragraphs describing the risk of an unsafe operating state had been stripped out. The recommended fleet-wide check had been downgraded to a customer education note. The conclusion had been rewritten to blame owner maintenance. The metadata showed the edit had happened 9 days after my signature, from an account tied to the Regional Executive Office approved by Vanessa Sterling's office. Back on my end, none of this existed yet. What I got was a call at 9:45 on a Thursday from a service manager at the Sterling dealership in Fairview, a man who hadn't returned my calls in 2 years and now sounded like he was speaking from inside a closet. People had been asking about me, he said. Not police, not a customer, corporate people, more than one, asking for my address. I asked what he told them. He said the truth. That I was the best tech he'd ever worked with, and that he'd been ordered not to hire me. Then he said he was sorry, word for word, and hung up before I could respond. I stood in my garage with a torque wrench in my hand and felt the floor tilt. Vanessa called 40 minutes later. First time I'd heard her voice in almost 2 years, and it hadn't changed, that smooth, boarding school flatness that makes an insult sound like a weather report. She didn't ask how I was. Her first sentence was a question, sharp as a scalpel. What exactly had I said to the man in the rain? I told her honestly I had no idea what she meant. A pause long enough to hear a door close on her end. Then she went in, warning me not to twist a roadside coincidence into reviving old, thoroughly discredited claims. Reminding me I'd signed non-disclosure agreements, which was true, and that I'd been fired for cause, which wasn't. Suggesting a man in my position ought to think carefully about which enemies he picked, given that I had a kid, a lease, and a business that amounted to 1 truck. I asked her one question: who was Walter? The silence that followed was the first honest thing she'd ever given me. She didn't answer. Instead, she said something I've repeated to myself many times since, usually laughing. That there were rooms a man who fixes cars would never walk into, and I shouldn't mistake one lucky night for power. Then she hung up. I stood there with the phone still against my ear and understood 2 things at once. First, whoever that old man in the rain was, he was someone who could make Vanessa Sterling afraid. Second, I'd stepped, without meaning to, back onto a field I'd been thrown off of, and people like her don't let that go. I looked out the front window when the world had rearranged itself. 6 identical black SUVs, windows tinted past legal, were lining up along the front of my property. 2 turned in and blocked the driveway completely, parked with the spacing of people who'd done this before. My neighbor Marjorie Finch came out onto her porch in a bathrobe holding a coffee cup she never drank from. Across the street, the Coleman brothers stopped loading their landscaping trailer and just stood there. 11 years on that street and nothing had ever made people look up before. Lily came around the corner in her school clothes with 1 sock on, and I moved faster than I've ever moved in my life. I told her to go to her room, stay away from the front windows, and not come out till I called her, used the voice I almost never use, and she went. Then I ran the calculation every working man runs in that moment. What have I done? What can they say I've done? What can I afford? I decided they were lawyers or corporate security, sent by Vanessa to scare me off the phone call, and that staying inside would only look like I had a reason to. So I put on my boots, walked out my own front door, and closed it behind me. The SUV doors opened almost in unison. Men in dark suits stepped out onto my gravel, 8 of them, none in any hurry. The one who came toward me looked to be in his late 50s, built like a retired lineman, gray crew cut, earpiece, a calm that was somehow worse than aggression. He stopped about 6 feet away and asked if I was Ethan Cole. I said I was, then said the only thing I'd prepared, that if this was about the car, I hadn't taken anything out of it. Stupid thing to say. I've decided since it wasn't stupid at all, it was just what 2 years of being treated like a thief puts in a man's mouth. He smiled, which wasn't in the script I'd written in my head. Said his name was Derek Voss, Director of Corporate Security. Then he glanced back at the middle vehicle, and the rear door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, silver-haired, 72 years old, and I knew him instantly and not at all. The ruined cashmere was gone, replaced by a charcoal suit that fit the way suits do when nobody's ever had to guess your measurements. As he came up my driveway, the 8 men arranged themselves around him without a word, and 3 people I'd later learn were senior executives got out of the last vehicle and stood behind him, hands folded. The old man from the rain walked up and put out his hand. I shook it. Derek Voss said, in the tone you'd use to pass someone the salt, that the chairman would like a few minutes of my time. Chairman Kessler. I want to describe what happened in my chest, but honestly nothing did, because everything just stopped. The name on the building I'd been thrown out of. The name on the badge I'd handed back. The name on the report that had been rewritten to make me a liar. I'd spent 20 minutes in a rainstorm fixing that man's car, turned down his money, and lent him a $4 rain slicker from behind my truck seat. He said good morning, apologized for the size of the arrival, and said that at his age he no longer got to choose how many vehicles came with him. Before I could put together a sentence, a silver sedan came up the street too fast and swung into the last open curb space, and Vanessa Sterling got out in a camel coat, heels sinking into the edge of my lawn. She'd driven up from Columbus, left, I found out later, at 5 that morning. She looked at the vehicles, at Derek, at Walter, then at me standing on my own property in work boots, and I watched her build a story out of it in about 2 seconds and choose to lead with it. She reached us fast and spoke before Walter could, which turned out to be the single most expensive decision of her professional life. She wished the chairman good morning, thanked him for handling this personally, said she'd come the moment she heard there'd been unauthorized interference with a company vehicle. Then, gesturing at me without quite pointing, she said that Ethan had always had trouble with professional boundaries, and that this was in fact part of why they'd had to let him go. It was fluent and practiced, and it landed on my own front lawn in front of my neighbors, with my daughter 30 feet away behind a bedroom window. Walter didn't respond. He just looked at her with the patient, neutral attention of a man who's decided to let someone keep talking. Most people would have felt the temperature drop and stopped. Vanessa had spent her whole life in rooms where silence from the head of the table meant permission, so she read it exactly backward and pushed on. Telling everyone in the driveway that I was a disgruntled technician with a habit of inflating routine maintenance issues into safety crises, that my termination had been thoroughly reviewed, and that whatever I'd told him on that road should be understood in that light. She said people in my situation often go looking for a wealthy audience. She said it looking straight at me. For a moment I was back in that glass conference room with 6 managers studying their notepads. The air in the driveway changed the way it does before a storm all at once, no sound. Vanessa said she'd been briefed. Walter asked if she'd actually read it. She said she'd reviewed a summary. He nodded slowly, the way you nod at an answer that's told you everything, and asked Grace Holloway to come up from the second vehicle. A woman in her late 40s in a gray suit walked over with a leather portfolio, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone carrying documents that have already won the argument. Vanessa's chin lifted half an inch. I've replayed that half inch 100 times since. She went first, still believing she could steer it. Calling the roadside incident a rare confluence of environmental factors, statistically insignificant, connector corrosion being a known feature of any complex vehicle in a wet climate. Good answer. The same one I'd heard in that conference room 2 years earlier, and hearing it again in my own driveway felt like listening to a recording of the worst day of my life. Walter let her finish, then asked why an identical fault code sequence had shown up in a company technical report filed 25 months ago. She said she wasn't familiar with every report generated in the region. He said this one carried her office's approval stamp on the revision. Grace opened the portfolio and held it so I could see too. I don't think that was an accident. There was my report. Not the rewritten one. Mine, with my handwriting in the margin of page 4, noting the humidity in the test bay. 11 vehicles, 4 states, the loss of signal event described precisely, the exact combination of heat, humidity, and low voltage needed to reproduce it, the risk of an unsafe operating state, and the 5-step verification procedure any dealership tech could run in under an hour. Vanessa didn't fold, I'll give her that. Instead she pivoted, the way people like her always do, going after the only thing about me she'd ever considered relevant, that a service technician without an engineering degree wasn't qualified to make system-level determinations, that the report in Grace's hands was the opinion of a man who repairs cars, not one who designs them. Said it in her reasonable voice, standing in front of a vinyl-sided house, to a man holding car keys, genuinely believing it was her strongest card. I answered her then, for the first time that morning, without raising my voice, because I'd learned in that conference room what volume costs you. I told her I'd never once claimed to have designed that car. Never written a word about what the engineering was supposed to do. My report described what the car actually did, 11 times, under conditions I documented and reproduced, and a car doesn't care what degree is hanging on the wall of the man watching it fail. I told her that if her position was that only the people who designed the system are allowed to report it breaking, she'd built a company that can never find out it's wrong. Walter turned and looked at me, and something in his face went cold the way a mechanic's does when the noise finally matches the diagnosis. Then he told everyone why he'd been on that road. For 7 months he'd personally been receiving owner complaints through a customer relations channel that still routed to the founder's office, because he'd set it up decades earlier and nobody had ever dared shut it off. Every time he raised it with the regional team, he was told there was no common pattern, the incidents were unrelated, the data didn't support further inquiry. He'd heard that phrase, no common pattern, in 4 separate meetings, and after 50 years in the business he'd developed an allergy to it. So he'd quietly pulled several vehicles from the field, put them into personal use, and started driving them himself. The sedan that died in the rain was one of them. That landed on Vanessa like weather. It meant the breakdown hadn't been bad luck. It had been a test she didn't know was running, and the results had been read by a stranger on the shoulder of a state road in under 20 minutes. Walter said it out loud in case anyone had missed it. A mobile mechanic with a 15-year-old scan tool had found, in a rainstorm, the exact failure her division had spent months insisting didn't exist. That he'd then installed a temporary fix, refused payment, and handed over a rain jacket. He said it with no drama at all, which was what made it unbearable. 2 of the executives behind him were now studying their shoes. Vanessa's composure came apart in pieces, starting with her hands. She said that correspondence had never been escalated to her personally, that her team had followed protocol, that if there'd been a gap it happened below her level and she'd find out who was responsible. Walter listened without moving, then asked the question that ended her career, though it would take another 11 weeks and a board vote to make it official. If Cole had been wrong, why had it been necessary to alter his report? Grace laid the revision history on top of the portfolio. 1 page, more than enough. Timestamp, user credential, the 3 deleted paragraphs shown in strike-through, the downgraded recommendation, the substituted conclusion, the approval line with the office designation. Vanessa looked at it a long moment, then said the edit had been a formatting standardization. Grace said, in the driest voice I've ever heard from a human being, that the standardization had removed the word unsafe on 4 separate occasions. Nobody laughed. That's when the tension in my driveway turned into something else, a woman explaining herself out loud, in front of witnesses, on the front lawn of a man she'd once said would never enter the room. Derek brought a second folder from the lead vehicle, and Walter told him to hand it to me instead of Grace. Thin, maybe 6 pages, and not what I expected. I'd assumed paperwork about Vanessa. Instead it was an internal memo from Regional Technical Operations, dated 4 months after my dismissal, sent to 11 service centers, marked internal reference only. I read the first page standing up with everyone watching, had to stop and restart the second because my eyes were moving faster than my understanding. It was a service instruction. It described a connector inspection at the harness junction behind the front wheel liner, to be run on specified vehicles whenever they came in for any unrelated service. Pin seat cleaning procedure, dielectric compound, post-repair voltage verification under simulated load. Step for step, the exact procedure I'd proposed on page 5 of my report. They hadn't even reworded it enough to hide it. The check intervals were mine, the thresholds were mine. Somebody had taken my work, stripped my name off it, and turned it into a quiet internal fix. I understood the whole shape of it standing there on my gravel, and it was worse than being called a liar. They hadn't ignored my warning. They'd believed it. Believed it enough to build a repair program around it, and run that program silently on vehicles that happened to come in for oil changes and brake jobs, without ever telling an owner why a technician was suddenly pulling their wheel liner off. Because saying it out loud, admitting the fault existed, would have meant a formal safety campaign across tens of thousands of vehicles, an eight-figure cost, a regulatory notice, and a permanent black mark on the record of whoever's region had produced it. So the fault got quietly fixed, and the man who found it got erased, and both were solutions to the same problem: Vanessa Sterling's career. I looked up and she was already looking at me, and for one moment there was nothing between us but the fact that we both knew exactly what she'd done. She tried pushing responsibility down the chain. The memo had come from technical operations under a director who'd since retired. She couldn't be accountable for every field instruction issued across 200 service centers. Walter cut her off, and for the first time all morning his voice had an edge. He said a company where the person in charge is never accountable for instructions issued in their name isn't a company, it's a costume. He said the investigation would start immediately, run by the board's safety committee and outside counsel rather than anyone in the regional structure, and that she was suspended from all operating authority, effective now. He didn't make a spectacle of it. He didn't shout, didn't fire her in front of my neighbors, didn't give her the kind of humiliation she could later tell herself was an ambush. He simply asked her to hand her access credentials to Derek Voss. She took the badge off the strap inside her bag and put it in his hand, and Derek thanked her, and that was somehow the coldest moment of the whole morning. She looked at me one last time, and there was real hatred in it. The clean, uncomplicated kind that comes from someone who can't locate a single thing they did wrong. I didn't say anything clever. People have asked since if I wanted to. The truth is the line I'd rehearsed in the shower for 2 years was sitting right there in my mouth, and it tasted like nothing. So I said the only thing I actually meant, that I never wanted her job, her office, her salary, her name on anything. The only thing I ever wanted was for her to stop asking me to say a car was safe when I knew it wasn't. Then I stopped talking, and she waited for more, and there was no more, and I think the silence hurt her worse than anything I could have added. She walked back to her sedan across the wet grass and drove off. Marjorie Finch was still on her porch holding that same cup of coffee. The SUVs didn't leave. 8 men in dark suits stood in my driveway in the cold, and Walter stood in front of my garage door, looking at the hand-painted sign my daughter had made for it when she was 9, the one that says Cole Auto in letters that get smaller toward the end because she ran out of room. I said something about appreciating him coming to tell me, hoping they got it sorted out. I thought that was the end of it. Walter said, "Not yet." He told me the real reason for the convoy. He hadn't driven 40 miles at 6 in the morning just to correct my personnel file that could have been done with an email. He wanted me on the independent verification effort, in the field, on actual vehicles, with the authority to open up anything I thought needed opening. I said no, fast enough to surprise myself. Told him I'd spent 2 years learning what that company does to a man who tells it something it doesn't want to hear, and that I had a daughter, and couldn't afford to learn that lesson twice. He didn't argue and he didn't sweeten the offer, which is the only time in my life anyone with that kind of money has done me the courtesy of taking my first answer seriously. Instead, he made one adjustment. He said I wouldn't work under the regional executive structure. Wouldn't report to Vanessa, her replacement, or anyone in the chain that had rewritten my report. I'd report directly to the board's safety committee, with Grace Holloway as counsel of record, and any technical finding I submitted would go into the committee minutes verbatim, unable to be edited by anyone below that level for any reason. Then he said the part that actually got to me. That this arrangement would exist whether or not I was the one filling the job, because a company that could bury a report once could bury one again. I stood there in the cold a while, then told him I'd come look at the cars, and we'd see. 9 days later I walked into Sterling Motors headquarters in Millbrook through the front doors, which I'd never done in 6 years of employment. Technicians used the service entrance on the north side. I didn't arrive transformed, and I want to be clear about that, because stories like this one usually end with the mechanic becoming a vice president and buying a boat. That's not what happened, and it wouldn't have been better. I wore a pressed shirt with no tie and the same boots, and I carried the same dented toolbox with my father's initials scratched in the lid, because I'd asked if I could bring it, and Grace said she'd consider it a personal favor. My hourly rate went from $40 to something reasonable. My hands didn't change at all. What changed was the geometry of the room. For managers in that first safety committee session had known exactly who I was 2 years earlier, had sat in that glass conference room studying their notepads while Vanessa explained where a mechanic stands. 2 of them had stopped returning my calls afterward. When I walked in with Grace, all 4 stood up. Nobody told them to. There's a specific silence that happens when people who once decided you were nothing have to reorganize that decision in public, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't hear it. I sat at the end of the table and set my toolbox on the floor beside my chair, and one of them looked at it like it was a loaded weapon. The verification program ran 6 weeks, covering over 11,000 vehicles across the eastern region. What it found was narrower than my worst nights had suggested and worse than the company had ever admitted. A batch of connector housings from one supplier plant, produced over a 14-month window, with a seal geometry that let moisture into the pin seat under sustained road spray. Not every car. Not even most. But enough, in a failure mode that put the vehicle into a degraded state at exactly the moment a driver would least expect it. Sterling opened a voluntary inspection and repair program before any regulator asked a single question, mailed every affected owner, covered the work at no cost regardless of warranty status. It cost the company somewhere north of $30 million. It got announced in a 2-page release that nobody outside the industry ever read, which is exactly what a well-handled safety problem looks like from the outside. The personnel side took longer and mattered more to me than I expected. Grace's review concluded my termination had been carried out on the basis of an altered record and a corrupted process. The company issued a formal correction to my employment file, reinstated my separation as improper, and sent written notice to every dealership and independent shop in 3 states that had ever been warned off my name. Frank Doyle called me the day he got his copy, and neither of us said much, and neither of us needed to. There was a settlement for lost income, negotiated by an attorney I didn't have to pay for fair without being a lottery ticket, which is the right way for that to go. And they gave me a title, Lead Field Safety Consultant, which came with one piece of authority I cared about more than the salary. I could refuse to sign off on a technical approval when the data was incomplete, and no one in the operating structure could override that refusal without putting their own name on a document that went straight to the board. There was a director in that final meeting, a man about my age with a very good haircut, who asked Walter why the company was handing that kind of authority to a mechanic. He didn't say it cruelly. Said it the way you say a thing everyone in the room is thinking, probably believing he was being useful. Walter took off his glasses and cleaned them, which I'd learn is what he does before he says something he means. Then he answered that when everyone else in this company was being paid to look somewhere else, this was the only man willing to look at the car. Nobody asked to follow up. The meeting moved on. I sat there with my toolbox against my ankle and my hands on the table and didn't trust myself to speak. 4 months later, on a gray Saturday in the middle of October, a single black SUV came up my street and stopped in front of the house. Marjorie Finch came out onto her porch again, which I found genuinely funny, and the Coleman brothers stopped loading their trailer again, and I walked out onto the driveway drying my hands on a shop rag. But there was no convoy this time, no men in suits, no attorney with a leather portfolio. Just Walter, 72 years old, getting out of the passenger side by himself, a driver waiting in the car. He was carrying a folded yellow rain slicker, $4 of plastic from a truck stop, laundered and folded like a flag. I told him he could have had someone mail it. He said some debts a man ought to carry to the door himself. Then he handed me an envelope. I assumed it was money, because that's what envelopes from men like Walter usually are. It was a photograph, the sedan, repaired and clean, parked in front of the technical center in Millbrook, and on the back, in fountain pen, in an old man's careful hand, one line, "This car brought me home. And the man who fixed it brought my company back to the road." I didn't put that photograph in my new office. It's taped to the inside of my garage door at eye level, where I see it every time I pull the door down. Lily came out onto the step in her jacket while we stood there, 11 years old and unimpressed by all of it. After Walter left, she asked why I still spent my Saturdays fixing the neighbor's junk when I had a real job now, with an office and a parking space. Fair question. She deserved a real answer. So I gave her the only one I have. That a broken car is still a broken car, no matter whether the person driving it is rich or poor, and that the whole mess started because a lot of very well-paid people forgot that. She thought about it, said okay, and went back inside for a sandwich, which is what 11 is like. It had started raining again by then, that thin cold kind that comes in October. I pulled the garage door up, and out at the end of the street somebody had their hood open, hazards going. I picked up my toolbox and walked out to see what was wrong with it.